Considering only those species of creatures living on Earth that have been scientifically identified, the total number is believed to be about 1.75 million. It's the natural environment that is essential for our daily life that is supporting all those lives. But what happens if the fine environmental balance is destroyed? And what happens if we unintentionally destroy biodiversity? The Blue Planet Prize acknowledges researchers who tackle such global environmental issues and help to provide a path for solutions. Regarded as the Nobel Prize in the environmental field, the Blue Planet Prize is presented every year to major contributors to the solving of global environmental issues. Winners receive an award certificate, a trophy, and 50 million yen. Over 50 individuals or organizations who have attained great achievements in conserving our blue planet have so far received the prize. Laureates have included researchers from a variety of fields, including not only natural science, but also economics and history. One of the 2020 prize winners is an ecologist who has deeply considered how our diet influences the environment, Professor David Tilman.
We have to be very concerned about two major human needs. One is how we get our food and which foods we eat, and the other is how we get our energy. I want to realize how important food and energy are to the future of the world and to the future of the quality of life, and to know that there are ways to meet our energy needs and to feed ourselves that are much better. If we are wise about this, we can create a wonderful world.
The other 2020 prize winner is a biologist who mobilized many experts from all over the world to report on the status of animals and plants at risk of extinction. Dr. Simon Stewart.
Are there ways in which we could recalibrate our world with nature and have a perhaps gentler and more compassionate world than we have at the moment? But that we have to work together, we have to treat each other as human beings, then that would be a good step forwards, wouldn't it?
Based on interviews with the two award-winning researchers, we'd like to consider human-environment relationships. As an ecologist, Professor David Tilman from the University of Minnesota has presented many recommendations in order to help maintain the global environment. They have had a great impact worldwide. Tillman's starting point was a biodiversity-related experiment. He drew the groundbreaking conclusion that the productivity and stability of a whole ecosystem is largely determined by species diversity.
Within the plots, for each plot, we planted a randomly chosen number of species, either 1, 2, 4, 8, or 16 species.
In one corner of a vast biological field station, more than 160 9-meter square plots were prepared, and up to 16 different species of plants were planted in each plot. Their growth per unit area has been observed for over 20 years.
This is planted with one species. It's this Indian grass, a nice native prairie grass. But look, it can't grow by itself. It's very patchy, not very abundant, very low productivity. And this is how almost all species look growing in monoculture. They just don't grow very well by themselves. You can see.
Although seeds were planted over the whole area, the soil is bare here and there with lots of gaps.
And you can compare this then with what happens right over here where we put in 16 species.
On the other hand, in this plot, 16 kinds of plants are growing densely, and there are no gaps showing bare soil.
You can see how much more productive this plot is. What's really surprised me about this experiment is that we'll look at a species growing in 16 species plots, and it's more abundant than when it grows all by itself.
Through this kind of experiment, Tillman discovered that species diversity is a major determinant of ecosystem productivity and stability. In order to protect the global environment, biodiversity has to be maintained. Tillman continues dispatching his message on what humans should do for that purpose. David Tilman was born in 1949 in Michigan in the United States. His house overlooked Lake Michigan, one of the Great Lakes. He was brought up free from all care, surrounded by the bounties of nature, with the sand dunes, woods and lake as his playground.
I would say I've always been a bit independent and a bit of a free spirit. I'd never liked to break rules, but I didn't necessarily like to follow them either. So after having lived my childhood out in nature very free, I had to go to school, to kindergarten, my first year of school. And I had to sit still on the floor, which I didn't like doing. It wasn't comfortable. And I asked my father if the teacher was my boss. And he said, no, the teacher is there to help you. So the next day at school, the teacher told me to sit down. He said, no. She said, well, you must sit down. I said, no. She said, well, why not? I said, well, you're not my boss.
As industrialization progressed in his hometown, the lake eventually got polluted. Feeling an intimate connection with environmental issues led Tillman to pursue a path in the field of ecology at graduate school. At that time, Tillman focused on agriculture, which is such an essential element of human life.
The single greatest human activity that threatens biological diversity is agriculture. We have already changed in a great way to grow food 40% of the lands on Earth. And I became very interested in and concerned about these impacts on biological diversity.
According to the United Nations forecast, the world is expected to have about 30% more people by the year 2050. What amount of food will be needed to cater for that increase? Tillman forecast the future based on the data on increases in food demand over the past 60 years in 100 countries. This clarified the fact that the demand for food per person grows considerably as the GDP increases and a country becomes richer.
And that was a real surprise. Most people trying to project future demand imagine there'll just be the same amount of food per person 50 years from now, and we only need 30% more food. But our work showed that as people became richer around the world, their demand for food went up per each person per day, went up very sharply. And especially the demand of all the cropland there had to be to grow the grains to feed the chickens and the hogs and the cattle and so on. And because of that, we are going to have to double global food production in a 50-year period.
Calculations of the farmland needed to match the double food demand shows that the current global area of farmland will have to be increased by nearly 1.5 times. It can easily be imagined not only that destruction of ecosystems is inevitable, but also that deforestation will increase CO2 emissions, which will have immeasurable harmful effects on the global environment. Tillman started considering what improvements should be made to agriculture to tackle this issue. Regardless of the conventional framework of ecology, he asked for cooperation from experts in various fields, including economists.
Because many people that I work with will work on they'll work on something interesting, but it may not be a big question. It may not be something that's really important for society to find the answer to. But Dave works on not only interesting questions, but really important questions, really big scientific questions.
Tillman set his sights on changing the spreading times for nitrogen fertilizer and the quantity used. He showed that by providing developing countries in particular with international cooperation, and technical assistance, it's possible to increase total crop harvests without expanding the area of farmland.
When we looked at the whole world and where population was going to grow and diets were going to change the most, it was in the poorer countries of the world, the developing countries, if you will. And we looked at their land base, we looked at the yields they could have on that land, and many of those nations can produce between 3 and 5 times more food on a hectare of land than they do right now if they can intensify agriculture. And we saw that almost every country on earth that is developing has in it enough existing cropland to meet their needs in the year 2050 without having to clear any more land.
Tillman advocates sustainable intensive production, which increases crop harvests while protecting the environment. This was cited in the 2019 IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land, and it has had a significant global impact. Tillman met his wife Catherine when he was a student at the University of Michigan, and they got married when he was a graduate student. They now live in the suburbs of Minneapolis and grow lots of vegetables in their garden.
I love the way this knife cuts it. I can make it in small pieces and then cut it across.
That was a good tomato, wow. Open my, you want to try one? They're really good.
Sure.
Isn't that good?
As a scientist, Tillman has never been a slave to convention. Catherine says that attitude is also very clear in his daily life.
If you want to know, he's not very good at reading directions about putting things together. So when we have projects that we put things together, I'm the direction reader, he's the doer. Because if it requires directions, he would rather just look at it and try to figure out how it goes together, and sometimes that doesn't work. So I read the directions. It just shows you that he just takes he's looking at something from a different angle. He looks at a different angle, like he looks down on something, or he looks at it from the side, it's the same with the science. He just is looking at a different angle.
Following his work on sustainable intensive production, Tillman worked on the issue of the tightly linked diet, health, environment trilemma.
We face what I call a trilemma, a triple problem in the world. Some of the foods we eat are healthy for us, some of them are bad for us. Some of the foods we grow are good for the environment, some are bad for the environment. And so if we have health and diet and environment, they're all linked because they all, in essence, affect each other. I was trying to find a way to solve this problem. Is there some way we could modify our diets in a way that people would actually enjoy, which would be better for them and better for the environment? Is there what I would call a win-win-win situation that we can find? That's my goal, was to try to discover that.
He analysed various types of food from the aspects of both environmental risks, including CO2 emissions, and health-related risks, including diseases and the mortality rate. This graph shows mortality risk on the horizontal axis and impact on the environment on the vertical axis. Both axes indicate a worse influence as the figure goes towards upper right. It's clear that eco-friendly food is good for the health. Tillman discovered that mortality risk and impact on the environment are deeply connected. Meat eating increases health-related risks. In addition, to provide meat needs a large amount of cereals to feed the livestock, and that also increases the impact on the environment.
So going from lots of red meat to very little can give you maybe 4 or 5 more years of life, but doing that can have a 50-fold or so change in how much environmental impact you have from your diet. So a relatively small change, which does benefit your health, turns out to have a really huge environmental leverage and cause, surprisingly, I was surprised by how large the benefits were environmentally, put it like that.
The research results have been reflected in the policies of several countries and featured in prominent global medical journals, attracting great attention in both the medical and nutritional science fields. Professor David Tilman continues offering recommendations on how human society should be in order to maintain ecosystem diversity for the future.
So many things that we don't think about are benefits given to us by highly diverse ecosystems. If we lose those ecosystems, we will lose those benefits, and this world will be a much less sustainable, a much less livable place long into the future.
Dr. Simon Stewart is a former chair of the Species Survival Commission of IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Today, he's in the middle of studying about a toad found in a small area of the Brazilian tropical rainforest.
You can see it's a very green toad with his beautiful red toes and belly.
Stewart uses the Iucn Red List of threatened species in order to assess the extinction risk of toad species.
The IUCN Red List of Threatened Species is the world's official listing of threatened species. So all this information has been reviewed by the top scientists and been checked.
The IUCN Red List provides a comprehensive source of information on the conservation status of animals, plants, fungi and other life forms across the globe. It indicates which species are at how much risk and how much conservation they need.
It tells us how threatened a species is, what its risk of extinction is.
It's not simply a list, but a critical indicator of the health of the world's biodiversity and serves as a barometer of life. Stewart is one of the central figures in developing the IUCN Red List. Stewart lives with his wife, Anne, in Bath, in England. Their great love is being outdoors. By exploring local rural districts, they always enjoy new discoveries.
Baby slow one. So this is it's a legless lizard, and it is desperately trying to escape.
Simon Stewart was born in 1956 in the West Midlands of England as his parents' first son. His father was an engineer and his mother was interested in dairy farming.
In those days, parents were much less worried about their kids, I think, and worried about their safety. My parents just let us wander, and providing we were home for dinner, then that's about the only thing that mattered, and it gave us, I guess, a big sense of independence. We certainly knew the area around us, and we knew the countryside. We knew all the different habitats. When I got to secondary school, so age 13, there was a biology teacher there who was a great expert on pretty much all forms of wildlife. We learned how to catch poisonous snakes, we learned how to catch fish and identify them. We learned pretty much everything. So this had a huge influence on me.
Then, through his former teacher, he was introduced to Dame Jane Goodall, the leading authority on chimpanzees who was living in Tanzania.
Jane Goodall invited me to go to Gombe Stream in Tanzania, in the gap between high school and university, to teach her son just basic primary stuff of reading and writing. But we did that a few hours a day, and then I spent the rest of the time learning East African birds, walking up and down along Lake Tanganyika, seeing the chimpanzees and the baboons.
His experiences in Africa interacting with nature stimulated Stewart to decide on his future path.
In those days, there was much less of a conservation profession than exists today. I applied to go to Cambridge to study biology, and the courses I did there set me on much more of a conservation course.
Stuart's wife, Anne, who was his classmate during his university days, describes him in this way.
Simon has always spurred me on, really, in that he has such knowledge. Whenever we go out for a walk, Simon will always point things out. Wherever he goes, if there are salamanders or reptiles or frogs or snakes around, he will find them.
Stuart chose to earn his doctorate with field research work in Tanzania, where he had been before. He spent 3 years in the mountains of eastern Tanzania, collecting data on the behavior of many species of birds. He discovered that most of the birds living there moved between locations at high or low altitudes according to the season.
And what that meant was it was no good conserving all the forests at the top and thinking everything would be all right if you lost the forest below, because you needed all the altitudes of forest for everything to survive.
That field experience led him to help produce the Red Data book about African birds. Then later he officially participated in the Iucn, the global network of scientists, governments and NGOs for wildlife protection. At that time, however, there was criticism of the Iucn Red List of threatened species regarding the ambiguity of its criteria.
One of the things that the Species Survival Commission did was to provide all the information for the Iucn Red List of threatened species, which was in the process of becoming the world's official list of threatened species. There had been complaints about the Red List for a while, that it was rather subjective. There weren't any strong criteria for deciding whether something was endangered or something was vulnerable. It was just some text.
Against this backdrop, Stuart joined a team which aimed to create new, scientifically reliable criteria. In order to deal with the many factors which can lead a species to extinction, the team conducted thorough hearings with experts in various fields as they pushed forward with their work to create the new criteria. They divided categories into 3 levels: critically endangered, CR, endangered, EN, and vulnerable, VU, and refined the quantitative criteria so that species could be assigned to the correct category.
You should only be able to get into a particular category if you meet the criteria for that category. So one of them is to do with a rapid decline in population, one of them is to do with a small and fragmented geographic range, one is to do with a small and fragmented population of the animal or plant, one is to do with a tiny, tiny population on its own. So this completely and totally changed the game, because one of the objections of using quantitative criteria was that different species are so different of each other. How could you have one set of numbers working for them all? But that's not a problem, because you just have to choose which criterion works for you.
In order to establish the data creation method, which objectively measures the level of a species' extinction risk, Stuart asked experts all over the world to use it.
Well, we could never have put the new Red List categories and criteria into practice if people didn't agree to do it. People want to know, is it a useful thing to do in terms of does it benefit the species? We've been able to show that by listing a species as threatened, 2 things happen. One is that other groups of people or organizations or governments go out and raise money and start conserving that species because they got listed as threatened. So you make conservation happen when it didn't happen before. And the other thing is that regulations get brought in by governments to prevent developments from happening where threatened species occur.
And then in 1996, the Iucn Red List adopting the new categories and quantitative criteria was published. However, not a few voices of opposition were raised against the new data.
We had some marine fish on there that were not previously listed. We had some tuna and cod and things like that as threatened. And the government fisheries agencies went ballistic.
For example, as a result of tests based on the new criteria, the bluefin tuna was categorized as a threatened species due to the remarkable decrease in its population. This was one of the cases which upset the Japanese government. Nevertheless, around 130,000 species have been assessed for the Red List to date, and the number is still increasing. In 2001, Stuart conceived and launched a new project, the Global Amphibian Assessment.
We worked with 550 amphibian experts from all across the world, and we looked at all 5,743 amphibian species that were known at the time, and that produced finding that about a third of them were threatened. Biodiversity is threatened by multiple drivers. It's not just habitat loss, it's not just hunting, it's not just pollution, it's everything. And when we look at the change over time, most species are deteriorating. It's only when we have good conservation action that species recover. So the situation of the global environment, as shown by the Global Amphibian Assessment and as shown by the Red List more generally, is we're still very much in a deteriorating situation.
After working for 22 years at the IUCN, Stuart was elected as the chair of the IUCN Species Survival Commission.
So it's the top job in species conservation because IUCN is the umbrella body of the conservation movement. And the Species Survival Commission is a very respected scientific body.
In 2016, Stuart left the IUCN after serving it for many years. Today, he's working with Synchronicity Earth, an organisation which provides wildlife conservation activities with funds and information. He made the decision after considering the importance of directly supporting people engaged in actual conservation activities.
Could we really be keeping people totally separate from wildlife? In some senses, yes, if disease is going to spread. On the other hand, it's when people come into close contact with wildlife that often they learn to appreciate it and love it. How we handle this is going to require some fairly important conversations to recalibrate the way in which we live with nature.
Two researchers who have been awarded the Blue Planet Prize for their achievements in helping to solve global environmental issues. Added to those from the past laureates, their scientific challenges and initiatives light the path to the future of a sustainable Earth. How should we proceed along the path they have provided? That is a task that every one of us has to face. This program was made possible by the Asahi Glass Foundation.